Welcome
Okay.
to everybody joining us.
Yeah.
As you're popping in, we can, if you can click that like button, we'll go up, we'll soar through the algorithm.
Soar through the algorithm. So that is always a good thing.
Yeah,
Come on, join us.
yeah,
You know,
join us.
I have to take care of one thing. I remember that. Hold on a second.
As you're joining, if you have questions, you can write a message down at the bottom, and we will happily try to answer any of your questions. But we'll try to get to it all to shut down Trump.
So
God
much
knows
to
what
talk
he's
about.
doing in Asia. The elections next week. Um, I want to take a shot at Mike Johnson when we get the chance in here. So there's plenty to talk about. Um, Michael, where do you want to start?
Give me 1 second just
All right,
to
take your time.
invite and make sure. There we go. Okay,
You can see
great.
we don't have a producer. This is all us, you know.
It's all us.
We have to
Um,
do it all for ourselves.
exactly. And Substack I like Substack, but it's not, the technology in this could be better. Let's put it that way. Um,
True.
so I want to start in the place for last week, but I just think it's important that we discuss this at every single one of our conversations. And that is Donald Trump's deep and abiding unpopularity. I just think it's such an important um, element of what's happening in American politics today, and that you just kind of have to keep hitting on it. And so we had a bunch of new data this week, which really kind of I think strengthened the argument about his unpopularity. I'm just going to read off a couple things that I think are of interest. First of all, according to the Economist's polling aggregator, Trump is at his lowest point. In, I think he's 18 points underwater, but he is actually lower now than he was in it's 18 points underwater, and it's lower now than he was in his first term, which is saying something because he was deeply unpopular in his first term. I actually went back and looked at the various aggregators, and what I noticed is that you talk that the shift from January to today is like 20 to 23 points from being in above water to being below water. So you've seen about a 20-point shift. Now, some of this is sort of what you would expect with a new president. There's what we call thermostatic public opinion, which tends to shift against the president in power, the president incumbent, but not like this. I mean, I think at this point Biden was 6 or 7 points underwater, and Obama was slightly above water. And Biden, by the way, is below water in part because of the Afghanistan situation. So what we're seeing is with Trump is historically unpopular incumbent president, historically unpopular. You sent over a couple, and I want to mention the Economist poll. They did a graph. You can see this. You got to treat the consequences. It's in it's in the roundup of the news today. He is underwater in every single swing state, as well as a number of red states, including Texas, where he is really underwater by a lot, actually. Florida, Louisiana, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Missouri, Iowa, Indiana. All of these, he is below water, barely below water. But I say below water, I mean more unfavorable than favorable in South Dakota, Nebraska, Arkansas, Mississippi. The places where he's slightly above water: Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Montana, North Dakota, Utah. And the places where he's really above water was like 5, 10 points. It was Virginia, Wyoming, and Idaho. But by and large, you're talking about a very unpopular president. So,
We'll see
and
where
then
West
finally, yeah,
Virginia goes when their SNAP benefits get cut off in a couple of days, since they have a
well,
very
yeah,
high
that's a good
SNAP
question too.
population.
A couple other points. The Democratic Party is now, according to Gallup's most recent poll, is now seen as a party better to keep the country prosperous by a 47-43 margin, um, which suggests that Trump has completely squandered his advantage on the economy.
And that
And
that doesn't sound great. But the trend line, 2023 was GOP plus 14.
that's right.
2024 was GOP plus 6. Now it's Democrats plus 4. That's an 18-point swing in 2 years.
And one thing to remember about Trump and the economy is that he was always very popular on the economy because people saw him as good good on the economy because of his experience as a businessman, which was always sort of silly, but that's how people saw it. And you're seeing that advantage evaporate. You sent along a poll that shows only 48% of Latino Protestants approve of Trump's performance. I don't have it in front of me. There's a poll earlier about Trump's just cratering with younger voters. So, what you're seeing, and even among white evangelicals, he's down to 72%, which is, pretty high. But
It's down 13 points though
right,
from what he got last year. This is from a public research religion or public religion research institute, something like that, PRRI. And they have him down from 85% of white evangelicals voted for him last year, 72% approve, and that Latino Protestant number was down from 64% in terms of what he got last year. So he's dropped. I'm not good, I'm not a math major, but that's a quarter of his popularity dropped off with them.
yeah.
Um,
But the bottom line here is that he is deeply unpopular, and this is, yeah, I think, in some ways, has become, like I said earlier, the defining construct of American politics today. I said this last week that on the shutdown, Democrats are polling slightly better. I suspect that a big part of the reason is that Trump is unpopular and people are just more inclined to blame Trump because they don't like Trump. So why does all this matter? Because in midterm elections, usually the best indicator of the incumbent party's performance is the incumbent party's approval rating. And so the more unpopular that Trump is, the less likely Republicans are going to maintain their advantage,
I,
particularly in the House.
I do think that sometimes, Michael, we over think politics. And it really
Yes.
may come down to that number, both in 2026 and in 2028, where if Donald Trump is woefully unpopular, Democrats are going to do well.
Yeah,
That doesn't mean people
exactly
love
right.
Democrats, but we have a binary here. You have two choices. And if you're pissed off at one of them, you tend to go with the other one. That is the history of American politics, and it can change very quickly. I mean, I think the best example being Lyndon Johnson absolutely filleting Barry Goldwater in 1964, and by 1966, Democrats were getting crushed in the midterms.
Right.
Um, every time we think, is this party dead? They're dead for about a year, and then they
Well,
bounce
look,
right back.
what has been striking to me, I agree with what you just said, but what is particularly striking about the how we talk about politics, particularly about the Democratic Party, is that there is this notion that Democratic Party is basically on life support and took this huge hit in 2024. Now, of course, they lost the Senate. Republicans already controlled the House. They lost the White House. Democrats lost by 1.5% um, in the popular tally, which is the lowest victory by popular vote since 2000. Okay, so it's actually not that impressive a victory. And second, we seem to all forget that in 2020, Democrats didn't just win the presidency; they won the Senate and they held the House. So what I think is interesting is that we just seem to seem to forget all of these things. Democrats are down right now. Republicans were down in 2021. They came back because of concerns about inflation, mostly because of concerns about inflation, and because Donald Trump's bizarre hold he has over the Republican Party. I just think that you can't talk about American politics today without talking about Trump's unpopularity, and that unpopularity is driving support to the Democratic Party.
I want to jump off of the unpopularity and that the map you were talking about of states, but first I want to note, I really don't think we've seen impressive victory since Obama in '08. This is either the first or second time in history that we've had three consecutive presidential elections where the winner's party lost seats in the House. And I often wonder how different we would be looking at 2024. I think it was like 7,200 votes in the House that if you would flip them, Democrats would have won the House. I think that we have to understand we're polarized, we're divided. People, quite frankly, are not particularly happy with either party at the moment, and no one's scoring big victories. But I want to come back to that
Well,
map.
actually, can I push back a little bit on
Sure.
that? I mean, Biden winning in 2020 by 4.5 points was a pretty big victory, right? I mean, that was bigger than Obama's reelection I don't think it was bigger than it was certainly not. I mean, Obama's victory in '08 was huge. It was certainly bigger than Bush's reelection in '04. It was bigger than I think maybe '96 is what '96 Clinton won by
A
like nine
lot.
points. And in 92, excuse me, he won by 5.8 points. But I just think in general, like it's worth noting that Biden's win was pretty big. He got 51% of the vote, which is pretty high for a presidential election. And I think you're right that we don't see huge victory like we used to, but that was a pretty impressive victory.
I was not particularly clear in what I was saying. They lost like they lost like 9 House seats. They only
Oh
won
yeah,
2
sure,
Senate seats on election night. He didn't have a lot of coattails, is all I'm saying. Like this was not a sweep for the party. Yes, Biden's number itself was impressive, but I was thinking at the congressional level that he didn't have a lot of coattails. This
right.
wasn't a like sort of sweeping, hey, we sign on for this agenda. We haven't really seen that since Obama in '08 when they
Yeah,
picked
you're
up
right.
big
I
in the
mean,
House and the Senate.
the Democrats like just crushed in the Senate. They had 60 seats after our own spectrum
Yeah.
switched. In the House, they won big in 2006, and then they basically expanded
I
their
think they added another
majority.
20 seats in
Yeah,
2008, if I
I mean,
remember
'08 is a
correctly.
weird election in the sense that you had a really strong candidate for Democrats, but really the bottom line was that George W. Bush was deeply, deeply unpopular. The war was unpopular, and you were in the middle of an economic um, depression, not recession, recession. And so all of those, it was a perfect storm
And
that
you had
led
the
to
8-year itch too.
8-year itch, which is a huge factor. Why it's very hard to win 3 elections in a row for any party. It hasn't happened since 1988.
Yeah,
Before that, it hadn't happened since 1952, I believe. So it's hard for a party to win 3 elections in a row. By the way, it's an underrated reason why Hillary Clinton lost in 2016 that
I
people don't
agree with
really, I
that.
think, appreciate enough. That I think people thought she should have won because she was, the economy was in pretty good shape and Trump wasn't that popular. But the reality is that it's hard for a party to win 3 elections in a row. It's just a reality of
It
it.
it really is because again, politicians make a lot of promises, and they rarely actually feel like their life has been made better by those
Yes.
promises. And so they get bitter and they say, "Hey, okay, let's try the other guys." But I do want to come back to that map you had of the state by state thing. Because one thing I said to my subscribers yesterday, and it's something that I'm increasingly watching, is whether or not we end up seeing localized effects on the midterms next year. By which I mean there was a New York Times piece that got me thinking about this over the weekend in Iowa and how Iowa and Nebraska have like the largest drop in state GDP in the first quarter
Yes.
of the
Yeah.
year. And one thing we saw in 2022, one thing that I'm kind of watching is we used to see midterms as nationalized. You had a national wave or you didn't. Now what we saw in 2022 was you got that in some places where Republicans did really well in New York, California, and the Southeast. But you didn't get that in other places. In some places you actually got a blue wave. And I'm watching whether Trump's farm policies crush him in places like Iowa and Nebraska. Um, and then you point out Texas, he's unpopular. That is a big state with a lot of interesting dynamics economically, culturally, so it's something to watch. It is state level unpopularity in some of these places because it could drive surprising midterm results. It may not. We're early. We're a year out now, a year and a week out from the election. So it may not, but it's something to keep your eye on that it's not just where are his national approvals? Where are the Democrats' national approvals? Where's, that kind of stuff. Elections, we're not quite still in the Tip O'Neill era where all politics are local. But local factors economically do play a role in
Yeah,
things.
it's true. Although it hasn't been, as you said, it hasn't been a real issue in recent elections. I think we can get a good sense of where we are sort of in politics based on what happens in Iowa. There's obviously
Yeah.
4 House seats that are up for grabs, the Senate seats that's up for grabs, where Republican incumbent Joe Ernst is not running. You have an open governor's race, so a lot going on there. By the way, before I go any further, if you have not subscribed to Brian Substack, The World According to Brian, you should do so right now. And if you haven't subscribed to Truth and Consequences, you should do so right now. We're a little low today. I got to say, a little concerned.
We
So
always start a little bit low
we
and then
do
we
start and we
build.
build up, but tell your friends, tell your loved ones, send them a link. This is we're gonna get this thing going. Only about 15 minutes in, so continue. So please, like tell
And
tell
we
everybody.
we build steam, Michael. We just
We do
gain
we do Bill
momentum as
Steve.
we go.
We
We
do
get worked
we
up.
do.
This just gets more fun as we go. So if somebody's not tuned in, get them tuned in right now. And we're not even selling you anything. We don't have any direct read ads to go with here.
No,
None of
no,
that
no,
kind of thing.
no. Just two guys who celebrate Simchat Torah talking about politics. So I do want to talk about the shutdown, but before I actually I'm gonna pivot a little bit here. Let's have a quick conversation about the elections. We are 6 days away from off-year elections we have gubernatorial races in New Jersey and Virginia. Race down the ballot in Virginia. We have a mayor's race happening in New York on Tuesday, which I'm voting in. Uh, Nothing I have seen this week has led me to change my mind that the most likely outcome for both New Jersey and I'm actually going to look up the current polling, but nothing has led me to change my mind that the Democrats are likely to win in both New Jersey and Virginia. And I guess one question I have is how much does that change the uh, attitude in Washington, or particularly among Republicans who are uh, resisting opening up the government, or certainly have played hardball on the shutdown. How much does that change people's and the attitude about whether the shutdown should continue, and also how much does it lead Republicans to consider possibly slightly distancing themselves from the president?
I think that the biggest factor is going to be whether any of these results surprise, either by the magnitudes of victories or obviously if the opposite of what we expect in a race happens. But I was saying yesterday to my subscribers, what I'm watching for is we think Abigail Spanberger is going to win in Virginia, and we think she's going to win by a pretty healthy margin. But does she
Yes,
crush, it's Earl Seal or Seal Earls,
Winsome Earl, Wyndham
Winsome
Earl.
yeah, I think it's
So
win
that's a
some
Twin
Earl
Peaks reference.
Seals.
Yeah.
But like, I'm expecting a high single digits, low double digits victory. But like if it's like 15 points or something, does that send a shockwave through Republicans? The race that might be most interesting is the Virginia Attorney General's race that neither
Yes.
candidate seems to want to win. We mentioned briefly Jay Jones and the scandals around him, but the Republican Attorney General Jason Marias, I think that's how you say it,
Mm.
has been acting like a candidate who really, really, really wants to lose this week, Michael. He refused to sign on to a lawsuit by Democratic attorney generals challenging the Trump administration not paying SNAP benefits on November 1st.
Wow.
So literally like starving people, even though he's in a bluish state and on the ballot. And then he also tried to claim that the effort of Democrats to redistrict was illegal, that the election had already begun in Virginia because people have cast ballots. So therefore, they'd have to wait another general election before they could redistrict. Like both very partisan things that
Yes.
I would not expect from someone in a statewide race in a blue election, with a blue electorate like that. So he seems to be trying to lose. So I'm going to watch that race. In New Jersey, again, we were talking last week about maybe Mikey Sherrill winning by 4 or 5 points. Like if she wins by 10, or Jack Ciattarelli wins, that I think will have a much bigger impact than if it's just what everybody expects.
So I'm just looking at the aggregate polls at the Times website. They among select pollsters, Cheryl isn't has a the last five polls are five. She has a 5, 7, 5, 6, and 8 point advantage. Now the last poll that was taken 12 days ago. So keep that in mind. Things could change.
The other thing that I
Among
think
all,
people are worried about there is in 2021, the polling had a Democratic bias in New Jersey. Now, obviously, that you could get the opposite from one election to the other. There's
right?
no correlation of past mistakes, but I know I saw people pointing out, well, Monmouth or whatever, whichever had it at 8 this time or something like that was like 8 last time, and it was like 2.5 was the final result. So I think there's some caution built in on some of that
Yeah,
because,
well,
in these races we get less polling.
so one thing I'll say with this is that you have there's more recent pollsters that are not considered select pollsters by the Times. Coefficient, I don't know what that is. They have it down to a
I
point
think
lead for
they're an
Cheryl.
online.
Qantas Insights has it as 3 points. A2 Insights, I don't know what that is either. Has 5. Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner, they have it at 12 points. That's a
That's a
Democratic,
Democrat.
right? Um, so I guess from that perspective, I mean, look, Citarelli doesn't hit above 47% in any polls. It just seems like you'd have to see a real drop off in Democratic support, and a sort of phantom Republican vote for Chitley to win. It could happen, but it seems unlikely to me. But I think one thing I want to go to Virginia that I think is interesting. Two things that have happened in the last week or so that I think gives some sense of where the electorate might be in Virginia. First of all, Virginia Democrats proposed a redistricting plan that would give them a very expedited plan to amend the state constitution that would give them an opportunity to add possibly 2 to 3 Democratic seats in the House. Um, First of all, they announced this before the election. I think is sort of interesting. Now, Spanberger did not endorse it. She was criticized for it by a Republican opponent. She didn't endorse it, and there is some need to announce this before the election, I believe. But I do think it's interesting that this happened. State Assembly, these guys are also up for reelection, and they seemingly did this 2 weeks before the election. I would imagine to juice Democratic support in part. So there's that element too. Something else interesting is also the AFSCME, which is the American Federation of Government Employees Union, came out this week and said to call on Democrats to end the shutdown, which I think for Democrats was an unhelpful statement. What I think is interesting, though, is Tim Kaine, who is the senator from Virginia, basically came out and said, "Yeah, we're not going to do that." He basically kind of threw cold water on the idea. Now, why is that important? First of all, Tim Kaine is Virginia senator. He represents probably the largest number of federal employees of anybody in the country, Gesundheit.
Thank
So
you.
he has to take into account federal employees when he makes that kind of a statement. So he's clearly saying that standing up to Trump is more important than basically helping government employees who haven't gotten a paycheck for 3 weeks. The second thing, though, is that would he be saying that if the government shutdown was hurting Spanberger, was hurting Democrats' chances of winning the governorship and winning, say, legislature races? I don't think so. So what that tells me is that the shutdown is not hurting Democrats, even in places. Well, I shouldn't make a mass conclusion, but it was just in Virginia where you'd think it would hurt the most because so many government employees have been furloughed. The Virginia senator is basically taking the position that, we're going to keep doing this. So I think that, yeah, again, like, Kane could have very easily said, we should do this and gone against his other Democrats. And frankly, it wouldn't have cost him all that much or Democrats all that much because, you need 5 or 6 or so to switch sides in order for there to break the filibuster on the shutdown. So I do think there's something to be read into that.
I agree with you wholeheartedly on that analysis of Kane's position. In terms of redistricting, the urgency for Democrats, and this is what Marias is saying is illegal, is I think to pass a constitutional amendment, you have to have successive legislatures separated by an election
Yeah.
to approve it. And so they have to approve it before the this election so that they can then turn around in January and approve it again. And he's saying because ballots have already been cast, that the election is already ongoing. That's going to be the Republican argument to try to fight this in court. But that's the urgency for doing it now. One other thing that just came across my I guess to my wire here, so to speak. This is a report from the American Academy of Polling and Opinion Research that said that the polls in the last 2 weeks in 2024 overstated Democratic margins by 2.7 points across all
Mm.
offices. That's smaller than 2020 when it was a 4.6 point polling error in terms of the Democrats, and 2016 where it was a 3.1 point error. So if you're wondering how accurate the polls are right now that Michael was just talking about, if you had the same error, Cheryl still wins in New
Probably,
Jersey with the
probably,
same, probably with that
but
same
very narrowly,
2.7
but very narrowly.
narrowly. And again, I think so much of politics in this kind of set of elections where these are blue places is about expectation setting. and which side exceeds expectations. If the margins are much narrower than people expect, the whole narrative nationally is going to be Democrats are in worse trouble than Republicans. Trump's unpopularity isn't helping them. All that. If it's the other way around, I think you're going to start to see Republicans get a little bit concerned. And I mentioned to Michael I think it was last week I talked about this. Watch people like Rob Whitman, veteran congressman in Virginia, Republican, is in the kind of seat that can flip in a wave. Watch the breakdown of the vote for governor in his district. If
Sure.
Spanberger wins there, that's a guy who might retire, who might say, you know what, it's not even worth playing around with
Absolutely.
redistricting. I might get out. And that's what usually fuels waves or retirements.
Yes.
Seats
And there are
opening
far
up.
more Republican retirements than Democratic retirements this year.
Yes. Yes. Although most of those are people running for higher office, but still, like, watch some of these outcomes to see if they're surprising. And the other thing that I have to bring up, and we're talking about elections, and I'm going to warn you now, and I'll probably say it again next week. The election that is going to get the most attention from the media is the one that you should care about the least and pay the least
Yes.
attention to. And that's the New York mayor's race. And it's driving me crazy that the left, the right, and the mainstream media is trying to make this into this huge thing and make Zoran the face of the Democratic Party. And it's preposterous. The New York City mayor always thinks that he's some big national player and never is. They usually leave office with their tail tucked between their legs and unpopular. But the only time that the New York mayor was a real national player was Rudy after 9/11. And that was a unique circumstance. But what's going on here is the left wants Zoran to be the face of the party because they want to be able to argue that everything has to move to the left. The Democrats must move leftward. That's the future. The right wants to make Zoran the face of the party because they want to hang him as a millstone around the neck of Democrats in purple places where he'd have absolutely no chance of winning. And the media wants to make this a story because half of them are based in New York. And so they're really focused on this race and care a lot about it. And it's easy to cover. And so they're giving it disproportionate attention. But the fact is, Virginia and New Jersey are much better indicators of anything than New York City, where basically a primary electorate in June decided that who was going to be the mayor.
If your analysis is that we should draw a conclusion from one of the bluest cities in the country, although not that blue, because we did have a Republican mayor not that long ago, um, versus the gubernatorial results in one state that is a lean blue state, one state that's a little more aggressively a blue state, you are doing poor analysis because there's simply no question that the New Jersey and New Jersey and Virginia races are much more emblematic of where the country is. By the way, one thing I do want to mention just about the polling, keep in mind that Democrats have overperformed in special elections this year by something like 15 or 16 points. So there's also a possibility that just the polls are not capturing the level of
They
Democratic
even
support.
overperformed, I think it was yesterday in an Alabama special that was
Yeah.
like 80-12 or something was the result, but it was still like a 2 or 3 point overperformance.
Yeah,
Um,
it's pretty crazy. Like the level of performance you've seen is been just off the charts. Um, Let me say this though about I do want to talk about the shutdown and what's happening, but let's just focus really quickly on the New York situation, Mamdani. So two things I think are worth noting. One is that in the last week or so, the public, let's say the reporting on Mamdani has gone much more negative. You have seen all of these clips that have been uncovered, and why they weren't found 5 months ago is beyond me. That sort of chronic or point out his past anti-Semitic comments, and some of them are really awful. For example, him saying that the reason we have austerity politics in America is because we're sending money to Israel, which A is not true, and B is like the perfect like anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that the Jews are taking money for themselves and they're screwing over everybody else. Um, I, this coincides with a poll last week I saw that had the race down to 10 points, 44 from Mamdani, 34 for Cuomo, Sliwa at 11, and then a bunch of undecideds. So I still think Mamdani is going to win, but I am struck by the fact that his numbers have not really improved. He's basically stuck around mid 40s. And I am, for example, the polling showed Cuomo making up a lot of ground. A lot of that was because Adams dropped out of the race, and it seems that most of Adams' support went to Cuomo. But it is interesting that Mamdani is not gaining support. He is basically where he was, and by the way, let's say for the record, If he gets 44, 45% of the vote in a New York mayor race in which he is the Democratic nominee in a race in a city that's like what 9-1 Democratic, that's not impressive at all. It really isn't. I know he's got two competitors against him, but if more than half of the electorate votes against him, it's not an impressive win. Um, I don't think he's going to lose, but I'm beginning to wonder if this race might be closer than we expect, because I do wonder if there's going to be a little bit of last second buyer's remorse about Mamdani. And I also, on a personal level, I wrote about this back when the primary happened, that it was ranked choice voting. I ranked my top five. I put three candidates. I can't remember who they were actually. I think I saw Stringer number one. I had Cuomo five. I had my dog at number four. I wrote him in because there was nobody I liked to put in to actually vote for. That was all because I didn't want to vote for Mamdani. I have been really having a hard time figuring what to do in this election, who to vote for. I don't like Cuomo. I don't want to vote for him, but I've decided I am going to vote for Cuomo. Again, it goes against it's hard for me to say that because I don't really like him. And I don't think he'll be a really great mayor, but I am genuinely afraid of Mamdani. And one more point I want to make about Mamdani that really concerns me, that there was a story out last week that didn't get nearly enough attention. Brad Lander, who was the city comptroller, who basically came out and endorsed Mamdani and really helped him especially with Jewish voters because Lander is Jewish. People, I think, suspected that he would be the deputy mayor. He'd be the adult in the room because Mamdani has such little experience to run the city. Well, now it turns out Lander was thinking of running against Dan Goldman for the House, which, by the way, I think he's a good chance of winning because, Goldman. A lot of progressives don't like Goldman for reasons I don't totally understand. And with Mamdani's support, I imagine it might be enough to get him to win the primary.
Well,
He's not going to be deputy mayor, which also really speaks to, I think, the fears he'll have about Mamdani, that he just doesn't have the experience. He's not surrounded by people who know how to run the city.
there's an interesting wrinkle in that story, which is that Mark Elias, who is the leading Democratic election lawyer, filed a lawsuit about Nicole Maliatokis's Staten Island district, claiming it's a racial gerrymander. And what they're trying to basically do is force that district and Golden's district to flip a bunch of territory. And Goldman was talking about, well, I'd be happy to represent like parts of Staten Island. So there's I see a world in which if they win in court, Goldman runs for the Staten Island seat, gives Ladner, is it Ladner or Landner?
Ladner, Lander,
Ladner,
Lander, Brad
Lander,
Lander.
Brad Lander, his seat. So that is also a possibility there. But I've said this before. I don't live in New York. I am really happy I don't have to vote in this election because I've never written a candidate in my life, and I probably would write in my poodle because I Andrew Cuomo is the ultimate sleaze.
Yeah,
It's an
I don't like him.
embarrassing to me
Yeah.
that the Democratic establishment couldn't put up a better candidate than him. But Zoran's anti-Semitism is a bar that I simply could not overcome. I also think that a lot of his socialist ideas are naive. Um,
Well, let me say my beef about Mamdani was was mostly anti-Zionism and anti-Semitic. I mean, I would say he's anti-Zionist who was much too comfortable with anti-Semitism. That's what I would say about
That
Mamdani.
that is the right way of phrasing it. I've been
Yes.
struggling to try to say this because there's a lot of debates about what is anti-Zionism versus what is anti-Semitism, and I view it as he's way too willing to flirt with anti-Semites. He's way too comfortable being in a coalition with them,
Yes.
and he knows that, and he knows it's a problem for him because he's rushing to try to assuage the concerns of people like Michael and I. He adopted a curriculum that Jewish academics came up with.
A
Said
friend of
he
mine
would
actually
support
worked
it.
on that. Yeah, which
So he's a
I
friend
think
of
was
mine as well.
I like that. I think probably maybe the same person actually. I think I like that. I thought it was good that he said that, but I just I will say to you that my all along I've said my issue with Mamdani reminds me of the Seinfeld line about when what's his name, Watley, the dentist, converts to Judaism, and it's clear he's doing it for the jokes. And Seinfeld said, "I'm not offended as a Jew. I'm offended as a comedian." And so my feeling on dying was I was less offended as a Jew and more offended as like a New Yorker. And I just thought that this guy simply lacks the experience to run the city. And I felt that because he is such a lightning rod that basically all people tell him to go F himself when he tries to, try to get tax increases or get some of his agenda passed. And so I think he just would not be a very successful mayor. But I will say, in the last week or two, I have my view has shifted a little bit, and I was have been surprised and disappointed at some of the things he has said in the past that I think are unquestionably anti-Semitic. And as I said before, his comfort with anti-Semites makes me extremely uncomfortable as a Jew, and it makes me even more uncomfortable that about a third of my fellow New York Jews are going to vote for this guy. I think it is extremely troubling that so many Jews are willing to look the other way at somebody who basically rejects one of the fundamental tenets of modern Jewish life, which is acceptance of the state of Israel. And look, can he affect? Does he have a foreign policy that's going to? No, but I find it troubling. And do I think he will be a threat to Jews in New York City? Probably not. But I don't like the idea of having a mayor who is so dismissive of things that are important to me as a Jew. So I'm not. So put those two together, and I'm voting for Cuomo. I'm not happy about it. I am not happy about it, but I'm going to vote for Cuomo because I think actually there is an outside chance he could win. I don't think he will, but I think it's. If you asked me 2 years ago, I said no way in hell. Now I'm a little less convinced he's going to lose. Although look, here's what this way: if Sliwa wasn't in the race, I think Cuomo wins. And I got to say that one thing I think that people have to keep in mind about this race is that Cuomo is, if any other Democrat was running against Mamdani, I don't think Mamdani would be where he is right now. The reason he got to this point is that he was the perfect foil to run against Cuomo. Cuomo comes in the race early, right? And he gets all the money and a lot of some of the major endorsements, and he gets all the media attention, and nobody else can penetrate that. And so what ends up happening is that he dominates the race. But when a situation like that happens, there is usually somebody who can sort of be the foil to that candidate. And Mamdani was the perfect foil. Young guy, not part of the establishment, new to politics, right? Not doesn't have this kind of like, sleaze bag issues that Cuomo has. And I do think that almost certainly is why he got to where he was. Now, I don't. People think that he's some unique political talent. I mean, he's a good politician, but again, he's running against one of the most flawed candidates I've ever seen. And New York City, we specialize in flawed mayoral candidates. Like was what we do. The best Democrats do not run for mayor in the city, and that's been true since I lived here 25 years. I've never voted for a mayoral candidate that I actually liked. I didn't like de Blasio all that much. I liked him more than most people did, but I wasn't a big fan. I didn't vote for Eric Adams. I liked Bloomberg well enough, I suppose. I just, at the end of the day, this is a city that has bad candidates, and Cuomo sort of continued that process. Mamdani is a good political politician. He's not a rare political talent by any means.
Yeah, I tend to agree with pretty much everything you've said on there. Here's a number that just came across that might be a good benchmark for us to watch for the elections. And it's back in Virginia. It's if Virginia Democrats win 58 seats or more in the House of Delegates, it'd be the first time since 1991 that they've held that many seats. So that might give you a kind of number. Are you over or under this? Like, is this a kind of historic sort of situation or not? Because I agree. I think everybody's going to focus on New York City. And I really don't think that we can learn much given how flawed Cuomo was as a candidate. Um, and how much he kind of froze things.
I
Another
agree with that
set,
100%. That's exactly
another
right.
set of elections I didn't even know was happening until about 45 seconds ago. There are 7 special elections in Mississippi for the state legislature. A court ordered redistricting to give black voters more representation, and it matters because if Democrats flip 2 seats in the Senate, they break the Republican supermajority in Mississippi.
Wow.
Um,
That's a big deal.
So,
That's a big deal.
there are elections throughout the country that are happening that are not these big name things. In Pennsylvania, I mentioned it before, it's judicial retention elections that will, if the Democratic appointed and elected justices are all retained, then the earliest Republicans could gain control of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court would be 2029. Um,
Good for Democrats.
as opposed to 2027. But like there are these elections everywhere that are important. And it was interesting. I was reading about our local school board elections got roiled because it's a very, very, very blue township. And the Republican candidates sought the endorsement of the 1779 project or whatever, 1776 project.
What is that?
it's some right wing Ryan James, is it Gerdusky or something
Oh
like
yeah,
that?
yeah,
Is the
yeah,
it's a right wing thing, and they sought the endorsement and got it, and then realized that was a very, very, very bad idea in a blue place, and claimed,
yeah.
"Look, we're just trying to show that we can appeal left, right, and center." And one of their ticket mates, one of the four Republican candidates, said, "Nope, I'm disowning you. I don't want this." But it just shows that a lot of this stuff has become nationalized. A lot of this stuff is having spillover effects, and the nationalization stuff means that you should pay attention to these local things to a much greater degree than maybe you did in the past.
I agree, and I think one thing we've seen in special elections is that they become nationalized, right? People are voting. Democrats have low favorabilities. I mean, this is the thing that's sort of striking about people keep focusing on the low favorability the Democrats have. It's true. They also keep winning special elections by huge margins. I mean, overperforming. And so I do think that there is people sort of are missing that part of the story that the Democrats are doing very well because elections are nationalized. I wanted to say good afternoon to the person who
I
said good afternoon to us. I wanted to say if you have comments or any questions you
Yeah,
want to ask,
drop.
please put them in the chat. We'd love to take your questions. But I wanted to hit on your point about nationalizing and the shutdown because we are now about 3 weeks into the government shutdown. And I got asked by my editors at MSNBC to write something about this. And do I think the government employees union calling for an end to the shutdown, does that change the equation for Democrats? Now, from what we can tell, Democrats are basically like, we're not doing anything differently. But I did think it was an interesting question to explore, and I do want to get your opinion on this, is that should Democrats consider caving and opening the government? And here's the argument for why. That beginning on next week, people are going to start losing SNAP benefits, which means people are going to actually lose food, um, uh, access to food, right? That's bad. And it's the kind of thing that I think people could die. So that's a moral issue you have to talk about. Secondly, uh, it's pretty clear that Republicans do not intend to negotiate. And in fact, it does appear that Trump doesn't give a shit about the government being closed, right? I mean, he's in Asia this week. I mean, he hasn't even attempted to meet with Jeffries and Schumer to work out a compromise, work out a deal. So this could go on forever, and it does begin to affect people's lives directly. Now, I can make the argument that that's actually good politically for Democrats. It's a very cynical take, but it's true. It is good for Democrats. The more people suffer, the more they blame Republicans, and the more that helps Republicans. Um, but have Democrats made their point by shutting the government down for 3 weeks? And are they almost better off just saying, look, we want to vote on extending Obamacare subsidies, which will probably fail, and then we'll reopen the government, and those subsidies are going to go up, and people are going to start getting letters in the mail next week and telling them how much the premiums are going to be increasing, and that's going to cause problems for Republicans. And are Democrats better off just sort of saying, we tried, didn't work, and we're going to basically let Republicans pay a huge price for these premium increases going up? Premium
I
increases,
think
I should say.
I think that the Democrats should not cave between now and election day.
Well, okay, I agree. Agree. And to my corollary is, does an election result which Democrats do well, does that change the calculation?
Yeah, I mean, I think we want to see what that outcome is. I am very skeptical that Republicans are going to cave at all. I also think that there's now an interesting paradigm here where, say, we get past Election Day. So Election Day is the 4th of November. The House, and we can talk about Mike Johnson because I have a lot of thoughts. The House hasn't been in session in 6 weeks, and the CR that they passed, the thing that the Senate keeps voting on to open the government, um, is only until November 20th. So all you would be reopening the government for is 2 weeks if you agree to this. And so to some extent, when you get past Election Day, you're almost calling Republicans bluff by opening the government back up, which is to say, Republicans have said, we will talk to you about all this healthcare stuff. We have ideas. We're ready to bring them to the table. We want to negotiate, but we can't do that until the government is open. Well, if you reopen the government, say next Thursday, that means there's exactly 2 weeks that you're opening the government. That gives them a chance. It calls their bluff. Are you willing to do something? Um,
The
and
problem
look,
is the Democrats the Republicans could pass a funding measure and Democrats would filibuster it.
Well, no. What I'm saying is,
on the
let me back.
21st.
Right. I'm saying you could shut it back down again if
Right. But
I'm saying that like we've gotten to the point here where you open the government up to say, okay, we you said you would negotiate. We're going to be the adults in the room again and bail you out because you're unwilling to negotiate like adults. Um, and we don't want people to starve because it's a big moral issue, and these benefits are important to Democrats. And by the way, some of of what I'm saying is dependent on the outcome of the lawsuit that a lot of Democratic states are filing to
right.
force the Trump administration to fund SNAP.
I mean,
And
the White House is basically refusing to provide SNAP money that has been appropriated in order to put pressure on Democrats, which is morally abhorrent. Just want to
yeah,
point that out.
yeah, yeah, they want to make it as painful for Americans as possible to have the government shut down. And so my
No. They want to get painful possible for Democratic constituencies.
that's true. They are doing everything they can to avoid Republican constituencies feeling this. Although
Right.
they do not seem to grasp, only Josh Hawley seems to get that a lot of these government benefit programs now are benefiting the new Republican constituencies. These they've done better with white blue collar voters, and a lot of those people are on SNAP. They're on Medicaid. And Republicans are really stupid that they have not adjusted policy wise for this. But, I think once you get into the back half of next week, you can say, hey, we're opening this up. And if you don't negotiate, if we don't make substantial progress towards a healthcare deal in the next 2 weeks, we're not voting for another CR in two
That's a really
weeks.
good idea, actually. I got to say, I hadn't thought about that, but you're actually right. Like maybe on Thursday after the election, you say, look, we, Democratic Party, we want to end this shutdown, and we want people to starve. So we're going to reopen the government, but that's only for 2 weeks or however long it is, and we want Republicans to come to the table and negotiate with us on health care and extending these subsidies. And they probably won't, and there won't be a deal. If there is a deal, and that's probably a win for Democrats because they can say that they basically forced the Republicans' hand. But if they don't, I mean, it is from a PR perspective, you could make the case that I don't know how much people are paying attention to that. I don't know how much of a PR win you really get out of it, but it certainly would. I mean, it's an interesting gambit. I mean, the thing is, I think it's a good idea what you're suggesting. I don't think Democrats are going to do that. I think Democrats have concluded that they're winning the shutdown fight. And the polling seems to suggest that they're narrowly ahead in this one and they're narrowly winning. But I think that they are feeling their oats, if you will. And they think that the vibe of Democrats standing up for Republicans is really good for them. And I think they see people like Marjorie Taylor Greene who are saying, we can't sock people with premium increases, and other folks in the GOP saying that. And I do think that, look, I'll go back to what I said a second ago about the response to the ASGE coming out again, calling for an end of the shutdown. You had multiple Democrats, not just Tim Kaine, but Hickenlooper in Colorado and somebody else like that I'm forgetting, who basically said like, we're not gonna give in. So I think that they basically, politics, a lot of politics today is about vibes, and the vibe is good for Democrats right now. It's good among their supporters. They like that they're doing this, and I think that they will continue to keep the government shut down. I mean, at some point you have to think. Look, the problem Democrats have is they have no easy exit ramp. Because as long as Republicans don't negotiate, there really is no way out of this unless they cave. I think your idea is a good one, but I just don't know that they're going to do it. And I will say this: the one thing I'm curious about is if Democrats win in New Jersey and Virginia, is that indication to Republicans that maybe it's time to end this because they're paying a political price? I mean, the thing is, the problem is that most Republicans are in safe districts and they don't give a shit about national politics because at the end of the day, they're not affected by it. If you're a Republican in a plus 20 Republican seat, you're not in any danger of losing your seat, even in a wave election. So and look, even the ones who are in danger of losing, look at like Mike Lawler in New York. I don't see any indication of him moderating his views. I think he's concluded. I mean, these guys are all concluding that they're more afraid of a primary challenge than they're afraid of Democrats beating them in a election next November.
David Valadao from California, whose seat's about to get much worse for him
Yeah,
after the election, is the head of one of their less right wing groups, like the Republican governing group, and I forget the other one might be the mainstream, whatever, or something. But the Democratic centrist group, one of the head of that wrote to them the other day saying, like, let's sit down and talk. And they're like, well, we can't do this till the government opens up. So like it shows this is across their party, across the caucus. And I think that first of all, realistically speaking, I think that there are some Republicans who would vote for the scattershot approach, which is there's a Democratic bill and a Republican bill to fund SNAP benefits in the Senate, and they're not going to pass because they're not going to get 60 votes
yeah.
for either of
Cohen
them.
has basically said that he's not going to bring this to the floor
You
because he doesn't
you
want to do one-off things.
you just started raising my point for me, which is to some extent the rank and file in the Republican Party don't matter. John Thune and Mike Johnson control the floors of the two chambers, and they are not interested in negotiating. They're not interested in doing anything to bring this to an end. The only thing I would differ with you ever so slightly with Democrats is I think you're right about the party writ large. But it's worth remembering that all it would take is four Democratic senators who have been voting to keep the government closed to say, you know what, I can't countenance morally people starving to reopen the government. So I would never
But
I'm
that
not
seems hot at this point. Seems highly unlikely. I just don't.
I
I don't think that's going to happen.
well, the only thing I would say is as we get deeper into November, as you get closer to Thanksgiving, I wonder if the moral qualms grow for some of them. But again, we're also now starting to get into a different situation, and I hadn't thought about my proposal until you asked the question. But we're getting
That's
into
why.
a
That's why
different,
these conversations are so good because we
yeah.
get to like think of this stuff in real time.
And if you're enjoying it, click that like button so
Click that
that
like
we
button,
more
that
people will
please.
come. That's what happens. But like when this CR passed, continuing resolution, it passed in. Um, he can interrupt. We can interrupt each other. We'll go back and forth.
Man,
We just
Pam,
don't.
that is rough. Wow.
We
Okay,
thanks, Pam.
but
Pam likes hearing from me apparently.
Pam is standing
But
up for Brian, and I appreciate that, Pam.
um, if you look when the CR got passed, it was September. It was ahead of the September 30th funding deadline. It was an almost 2 month CR. Well, now we're in a situation where we're down to it's October 29th. This runs through November 20th. So once and nothing's going to happen before election day. So now you're talking about November 4th. So
Right.
it's a very different ball game here because reopening the government, they'd almost immediately have to pass another thing to to keep the government open. I mean, people forget that the 95-96 shutdown, which shaped so much of what we know or think we know about shutdown politics, was not one shutdown.
It was two
There were like,
shutdowns.
yeah, there were multiple shutdowns
That's
where they
right.
reopened it, and then there was a long shutdown. The last one was longest.
Wasn't it the
But
first
so
one was like a few days, and then they came up with a deal, and then the second one was like a month or something?
I thought that there might have even been three, like a couple of days, then like 10 days, then like 4 weeks or something.
Uh-huh.
But it was something where it wasn't just one shutdown. It was like 3 months of back and forth and shutdown, then open and that kind of thing. So it would not surprise me to see Democrats say, okay, we're going to open this back up, but we're not voting for anything beyond November 20th unless we're making progress in these talks. Unless
That's
you
right.
are giving us something on healthcare, you get 2 weeks and that's it. And that would call their bluff. Look, the House would actually have to come to work, Michael. Think about
One
the
thing that I think
imposition
is
on them.
really interesting, and I want to mention this because someone made it the point to me yesterday. I thought it was really a smart observation, which is that, one of the reasons I think Republicans are losing the PR campaign on this is because the House Republicans just have not been in Washington. And why are they not in Washington? Because they don't want to swear in. I mean, this Congresswoman, I'm always trying to pronounce her name,
Gravila. Is
Gravila,
it Adalita? I mean,
Adelita, who, by the way,
but
she was elected 36 days ago. and still hasn't been sworn in. Why hasn't she been sworn in? And why are they afraid to have the Republicans meet to Washington? Because if she is sworn in, then the resolution to vote on the releasing the Epstein
Discharge
files,
petition.
discharge petition, will pass. So it's interesting that the Epstein situation is actually the big reason why Republicans are staying out of Washington and why they're losing the PR battle on this. Look, it also isn't helping that Trump is going to friggin' Asia for a week, or that he's basically destroying the East Wing of the White House and building a fakakta ballroom. That is not helping either. And it's like, the fact that he doesn't seem to care about this stuff. But again, I got to what I said earlier. I think Democrats have concluded that caving is not worth it. Look, I'm of the view that they could cave now and they would pay a minimal political price. Yes, some liberals will complain, say they gave in, but they shut the government down for 20 days. They made a good faith effort to do this, and it'll be forgotten in a year. And frankly, the subsidy, the expiration of the subsidies and premium increases in Obamacare are going to really hurt Republicans. So from that, but I think that they are saying at this point, look, we need to maintain support of our coalition. We need to tell Democrats and convince them that we are going to fight for something, and that's what they're doing, and that's why they're probably not going to open the government again
And I just go back,
anytime soon.
I made this argument over and over again in August, September, and people didn't seem to want to listen to it. But Republicans, a couple of Republican members of Congress have now said this, where constituents are accosting them about benefits losses or things that they can't access because the government is shut down, and saying, do something about this. And I really do think that we overestimate how much Americans understand about government. And by we, I mean pundits, I mean the DC governing class. It was always everyone, the theory of the case was, well, shutdowns always hurt the party responsible for shutting things down. Okay. But what people didn't seem to understand is this is unified government. Most Americans do not understand the filibuster rule. By the way, it's the same reason that Democrats struggle to get rid of the filibuster.
I agree.
Um,
I agree.
is and to get people to understand, look, we can't do all these things we promise you because we don't have 60 votes. People don't get any of this fundamentally. The whole 60 vote thing is not something that anybody but those most tuned in understand. Well,
Right.
but what does that mean when the government is shut down? It means if you control everything, they're going to blame you,
That's
whether
right.
it's the other guys technically standing in your way, because you otherwise have to sit there and explain to them, see, the Senate's got this rule you have to understand. And yeah, we control things, but we don't actually control things in this case because we need Democrats to sign up. Like, people don't want to hear explanations. There's an old adage in politics: if you're explaining, you're losing.
Yeah.
And I think that that's absolutely part of what's going on here. And it does not help that instead of a president who is hammering the Democrats every day, taking advantage of the bully pulpit, this is
He's
his
not.
second foreign trip. He had the ballroom stuff in between the foreign trips. Like, he doesn't care that the government is shut down at all. Like, not even a tiny bit. And frankly, we haven't talked about this before, but I kind of think that Donald Trump's attitude right now towards the presidency is, I got my entire domestic agenda in my big beautiful disaster bill in July, and I don't really care about domestic policy or domestic politics anymore. I'm focused on trying to be Mr. Statesman
Yeah, he
and
wants a legacy item.
globetrotting.
He wants
Right. He
look.
wants a
Part of the
legacy.
ballroom is he wants a legacy item.
That's exactly right. And he sees that as being easier to achieve in foreign policy. And he's just tuned out on
I
all of
agree.
this stuff. I mean, again, SNAP benefits run out in 2 or 3 days for a lot of Americans. The
Something like
people,
30 million people.
30 million struggling Americans. He is abroad right now. And I don't know exactly what day he comes back, but like a president who cared, who was, or just a president who was a cynical bastard who was politically savvy, um, would be at home, like meeting with SNAP recipients, like hammering the
Absolutely.
Democrats on this
Absolutely.
every day. He's doing none of
Absolutely.
this. He
But
is, and he's outsourced his messaging to Mike Johnson, who is terrible at this.
Yeah,
And
Johnson's not a great messenger.
in fact,
Um,
can I
yeah,
go
go
off
ahead.
on
Sorry.
him? I've been waiting
Please
to
go
tee
off.
off on this guy. There were finally a couple of pieces in the one in the Times over the weekend, and I forget where the other one was, that we're actually hammering him for the damage he's doing to the institution of the Congress by keeping them out of session. And I think this cannot be underscored enough. I actually was corresponding with a reporter who wrote about this the other day. Mike Johnson shut the House down. I think they've been in session for like 18 days or 22 days since the 4th of July. Okay. He doesn't want his members around. They aren't doing anything. They've basically outsourced everything to Trump. He can decide whatever he wants. We're not going to do anything. And they are doing irreparable damage to the institution of the Congress, to checks and balances. And this 20 days out of 121. Debbie, thank you. That's the number. And that number just grows every day. And this is not only deeply irresponsible, but historically, it's pretty unprecedented. If you go back in history,
Yes.
Mike Johnson, and this is what I really want to hammer him on, he said the other day, kind of flippantly, well, this is just what unified government looks like. But that's not true. If you go back historically, Jimmy Carter tried to cancel water projects in key senators or congressmen's districts in the 70s. Democrats had big majorities, tried to cancel water projects, and heavy hitters in Congress went to him and basically said, would you like your agenda to pass or would you like it not to pass? If you would like it to pass, you're going to restore these projects because that's how this works here. We are a co-equal branch of government. And it's not just that example. Bill Clinton had a 57-seat Senate majority, a large House majority. His health care plan didn't pass. George W. Bush's Social Security plan didn't pass with a
Right.
Republican Congress. But, unified government didn't used to mean whatever you want, you just say, yes, sir.
Yeah.
That is not how this is supposed to work. That is not how this ever worked. I mean, the best example would be Franklin Roosevelt in court packing, but he
Yeah.
also didn't get universal health care like he wanted.
I'm sorry to upset
No, go, jump
Pamela
in.
by interrupting, but let me make a comment here because what you're describing and what's happening is that the Congress has completely subjugated the prerogatives of the legislative branch to Donald Trump. And I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, actually, who made this. I brought up this fact that by the way, do you know off the top of your head who was the Senate Foreign Relations Chairman?
It's Jim Risch from
Jim
Idaho, isn't
Risch.
it?
But I guarantee you that the number of Americans who could answer that question is probably less than 1%. He is the most invisible Senate Foreign Relations Chairman in my lifetime.
He's old. He's really old.
And it doesn't even give a shit about foreign policy. So last week, he was asked by reporters, are you going to have any congressional hearings over the Trump's now flagrant killing or attacks on drug boats in the Pacific and the Caribbean? And he said no. And I was talking to this person. I said, this is insane. And this person kind of just like exploded on me. And it's like, do you realize there have been no frigging hearings on, they basically destroyed USAID? Not a single hearing. Hearings on the Iran nuclear strikes? Not a single hearing. Hearings on the terrorists? Not a single hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senate Foreign Relations Committee used to be, I mean, we're going back a long time here, was the
Bill
locus of opposition
Fulbright.
to the war in Vietnam, Bill Fulbright, right? But and but even that notwithstanding, because the influence of the committee diminished over time, but alleged drug boats. Thank you, Larry. Uh, Basically, Trump is engaging in, and I just mentioned this, in a war attacking drug boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific that we do not know are drug boats. He claims they are. And beyond that, he has provided zero legal justification for what he is doing. And Congress has done nothing. Now, Congress used to actually care about use of military force, used to care about its ability to influence foreign policy. That's gone for many years now. But to not even have a friggin' hearing, a hearing on major foreign policy events that speak to the president's ability to wage war, which has been a perennial
Hey,
dispute between Congress and the presidency for hundreds of years, is insane. They have basically said, we don't give a shit about congressional prerogatives when it comes to foreign policy. And
anything.
anything,
They,
anything. It
they've
is
let him undermine the spending power of
absolutely,
the
yes.
Congress and just not spend money and dismantle agencies that Congress created that the president can't get rid of. Now that Russ Voigt is bragging, or Vote is bragging that within 2 months, he's going to dismantle the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, which he can't do.
He
That
can't
is
do.
illegal. And look,
Look, they couldn't do what they did to AID, and they did it, and
right,
nobody
right,
stopped them.
right. And look, I think that the drug boats, alleged drug boats, is a vexing issue for Democrats because I think a lot of Americans approve of this. But it is flagrantly illegal. It is dangerous for the president, to any president, to be able to just decide, yep, you're a narco terrorist, so we can kill you.
Yes,
You don't want to live in that society. But put that aside for 1 second. We are amassing forces potentially to take some sort of action in Venezuela, and there's been no hearing on that. Like
right.
he might start a war with no congressional authorization whatsoever, which is constitutionally, like, it's flagrantly
In
unconstitutional.
fairness, he wouldn't be the first president to do it. But the
No, but
Venezuela
at
thing
least
is even more shocking because I can't see that there's any rationale whatsoever for going into this,
no,
except that they want to get rid of what's the name, Maduro.
right. And look, usually there's some sort of fig leaf, the Gulf of Tonkin kind of resolution, which was not a
Tonkin.
declaration of war, but it was something. But there's not even a fig leaf here
No.
that would allow him to wage any sort of military campaign in Venezuela legally. And again, Congress doesn't matter. And some of these people, a guy like Risch, it's so bad. He's 82. He's not running, most one more time. Like he should care about the institution, and that's what they used to do. That's
This
what,
is what is so shocking to me. And
yeah,
I'm going to tell a story. By the way, again, if you have any comments, questions, please put them in the chat. But I remember the story years, like during the impeachment, there was a whole issue about whether they were going to get John Bolton to testify. And basically, a few Republicans were going to go along with it, but the swing person was Lamar
Lamar
Alexander,
Alexander.
who was not running for reelection, was retiring at the end of the year. I remember I called this somebody in Tennessee, who's a close observer for the state's politics, and I'm like, I don't get this. Like, he's not running for reelection. He's nothing to fear from Donald Trump. Why not just agree to this vote? I mean, he's clearly torn on the issue. Agree to have Bolton subpoenaed. And the guy says to me, "Look, Lamar Alexander's a Republican. He's going to go after he retires to a Rotary, uh, uh, you know, uh, meeting, and he doesn't want to get booed. He doesn't want to get attacked." I mean, I was sort of stunned by it, but I understand, like, that's the rationale. And the problem is that these guys, I think there's, first of all, a real uh, pushing of fealty by Republicans to authority. And it's one of the reasons why they've sort of bent the knee for Trump. And, politically, you could argue it's been good for them. It certainly helped them win the Senate in 2024. Probably helped them win the Senate. Although arguably they might have done worse, if they might have done better if they hadn't had Trump on top of the ticket. Maybe, that's hard to say. But I think they just don't want to piss off Republicans. They don't want to deal with the aggravation of it. And I think what Lisa Murkowski said a few months ago about how a lot of people on the Hill are just afraid of going against Trump, afraid for their personal safety, is what's driving this. I mean, it is. Look, you could talk about all the bad things with Donald Trump, and I could spend, we could spend the rest of the day, the week, the month, the year talking about all the bad things with Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, like, he is a president who there are constitutional constraints on his behavior. And this Congress has simply decided we are not going to exercise any of these constraints. Like, we're just not going to do any of them. We're going to let him do whatever the fuck he wants to do, and we're not going to try to stop him. And, that is why he is where he is, because Republicans have basically said they're too big a cowards. I mean, this is the thing. This is crazy. But there's an article in Semaphore this week about how the Senate Republicans are desperately hoping that the Supreme Court limits
Oh,
Trump's
just
ability to impose tariffs, which, by the way, is a absolute 100%. Just, this is a good little media uh, uh, literacy thing. This is they are leaking this on purpose to send a message to John Roberts and Patrick and Kavanaugh and so forth that you need to stop him on this. Okay, that's what they're doing. But they have the frigging power to do it themselves. But they're too big of wimps. They're too big of cowards to stop what he is doing on tariffs. They want Supreme Court to do it for them. It reminds me of that scene in Curb Enthusiasm where, Larry spills wine on him and his mother-in-law says, somebody get a sponge. He goes, why don't you get a sponge? And they're basically the caucus of, let somebody else get the sponge. We don't want to do it, because that's what's basically happening.
if you ever have to get in a fist fight in your life, you want to be with a Republican member of Congress because they're the biggest wimps on earth. I was struck, I don't know if it was the same story or if it was a different one on the tariffs where two Republican senators were willing to go on the record saying, I hope the Supreme Court blocks this, and that was Murkowski and Collins, the same two it always is. And
Yes,
then they quote a bunch of other anonymous Republican senators because they don't even have the guts to say we hope that the Supreme Court upholds our power when we won't on the record. And
right,
I've seen theories that some of these people are also worried about their own, like, social ostracism in their own networks. That I saw that a lot about Lamar Alexander. And by the way, since Michael brought him up, let's remember Lamar Alexander's roots. Tennessee Republicans used to be establishment, but not just establishment, like good government. And Howard Baker is the paradigm. And Lamar Alexander came up with him in the same wing of the party. He was a young governor in the 70s. And he wouldn't stand up to Trump. He just wrote an op-ed last week because he's on Vanderbilt's board of trustees about not wanting federal power to dictate education, and saying this is not conservative. Some trying to come up with a conservative rationale to fight back against Trump, but it was very milk toast, and he's already retired.
right.
Um, but
Nobody
but
cares what he says.
Right. None of these people, and again, Jim Risch is 82. Mitch McConnell has pushed back a little, but only a
And he's
little, and
retiring now.
he's retiring, and he's what, 84? And oh, by the way, if Donald Trump ever made racist attacks against my spouse, I sure as hell would not be rolling over and doing anything. I would be opposing him tooth and nail. But Mitch McConnell was just like, he's a
One of the most
Republican.
extraordinary moments that I can remember in following politics is that after McConnell gave his speech basically attacking Trump for what he did on January 6th, although he acquitted Trump from the impeachment trial. He went on TV to explain what he had done, and at the end of the interview, the interviewer asked him, he was on CNN, would you still endorse Trump if he's the Republican nominee in 2024? And McConnell said yes. And that's the bottom line. Because I remember John McCain saying, party over country, or country over party. With these guys, it's party over country.
Yeah, and it's gotten so much more intense. Um, than it used to be. And the country over party people are gone in the
They're
GOP.
gone. They're gone.
You have Murkowski's the only one you could possibly say that really fits that brand anymore. And it's really, really sad. It's bad for the country. And the scariest part to me is it's not even just that they're putting party over country. It's that they don't even care about their own power.
Yeah.
There's something wrong, psychologically. I think we're hardwired to protect our own power, our own authority.
Yeah,
And
they
these
give it
guys are
up.
just like, you take it, Donald, here, please. Or
Frankly, their ambition, it matters more to them, and their political standing, keeping their jobs matters more to them than doing what's right. And they'll never do what's right. They'll never stand up for what they believe in. Listen, we got to finish up pretty soon, but I want to touch on, because I wrote a big piece about this earlier in the week, the Maine Senate race. We talked about quite a bit here, and there's been some interesting polling. By the way, Larry Simon, I agree. Mitch McConnell could have brought in along enough Republicans to convict Trump in the Senate, which would have ensured he never could run again, and he didn't do it. And he
I
wanted to do. He thought
actually,
about doing it.
I actually disagree on that. I actually think that Mitch McConnell ended up voting to acquit in the impeachment trial because he did not think that he could get another 8 Republicans. 7 Republicans voted to convict, right? So that was 57. So they needed another 10. So with McConnell, it would have been 9. I think he didn't think he could get another 9. I think he thought that he would end up voting with, like, maybe he would have gotten 3 or 4, and he would have ended up voting with, like, 25% of his caucus, and would have had to step down as leader and didn't want to do that. But I actually don't think he thought he had the votes. I think he thought that this
I
stuff
don't
was
know.
so
It's
entrenched.
unknowable. It's unknowable. I actually think if he had lobbied Republican senators and made the case for why this is best for the party and best for the country, he could have succeeded. But we'll never know. But
Yeah, I think he could have gotten 4, maybe more. But when I've started to do the math of who you then get down to, it was people who were younger and more ambitious, and
seven Republicans voted to
yeah,
convict. Was
Yeah,
it what
and I
Romney,
thought that
Collins, Murkowski,
uh,
Cassidy,
Pat Toomey, Richard Burr,
and
um,
the guy in Nebraska, Sass?
Ben Sass, that's right. And I think that they could have gotten, I think Roy Blunt was also retiring. So they could have gotten Blunt
Yeah,
and maybe like I thought he could have gotten a couple of his establishment allies. Um, but like Roger Wicker or somebody like that. But
yeah,
when
maybe.
you start to get beyond that, now you're talking about people who were not really beholden to McConnell, who were younger. The
Right.
math started to get a lot dicier for him to get like the 67th vote was going to be somebody pretty right wing, who I just wasn't sure he could get. But that is just was always
I just
my
think if
theory.
McConnell publicly comes out in favor of conviction, I think it does push a lot of Republicans to that position because they're going to calculate that he's thought about the politics of this and decided it was the best thing for the party. But let's talk about Maine really quick because I want to just we should end on this. Nothing much has changed. There've been some interesting polling out that suggests that it was interesting. There was a poll last week that had Platter with like a 20 or 30 point lead, which seemed suspect to me. And then there was another poll out this week that had Mills with like a 7 or 8 point lead, but that lead ballooned to like 29 points when people find out about the Nazi tattoo. And then there was sort of anecdotally, Alex cites Weld used to write at NBC, moved up to Maine. He was on TV and NBC and basically said, "Look, I've talked to a lot of people, and no one's switching their votes over this Nazi tattoo thing." I mean, look, it's November. The primary isn't going to be for I don't know when it is, probably in the spring or summer. There's a lot of time to
June.
go here. It's June, yeah, it's a lot of time to go. I just think that the whole situation is baffling. Now, I want to be clear that this is not unusual for a party to turn on itself after electoral defeat. We saw this in 2010 with the Tea Party. And, the Tea Party inarguably cost Republicans a host of Senate seats, probably 4 or 5 Senate seats, Delaware, Colorado, Nevada, probably a few other places as well. So, and really, you're not seeing this kind of primary challenge on the left happening in other places. Like John Ossoff, who, by the way, just to go back a second, has been steadfast in supporting the shutdown, just for what it's worth. He is the most vulnerable Democrat in the country. He's not getting a primary challenge. Um, the Plattner thing is just super friggin' weird to me because it's like a Democratic Tea Party. Basically, people who are prizing political, I don't know, authenticity over actually winning an election. And I feel like this is very unusual for Democrats because Democrats tend to be much more pragmatic. If you look at these Senate races in swing states over the past couple of years, Democrats dominated. By the way, I just want to say, I've been making this point now for months. No one's paying attention. Charlie Cook, not because of me, but Charlie Cook wrote a good piece of the day, basically pointing out that the reason why that Democrats have a big purple state problem, which they do. They're not. They're underperforming in purple states. They're not winning elections there. I think it was in my roundup today. It's a really important point that he was making, and I've been making this for a while now. But nonetheless, Democrats are pretty pragmatic. They usually vote for the more milquetoast, moderate, less extremist, solid, not spectacular candidates, and they usually win. So I kind of suspect at the end of the day that Plattner's that's why he's going to lose. I kind of think when all push comes to shove, Democrats are going to make the pragmatic choice that they'd rather go with Janet Mills, who is not exciting, but is a safer candidate and more likely to beat Collins. And I want to just point out, though, that like one thing that this whole situation with Plattner and has exemplified is how people are just completely misreading what happened in 2024. There's an argument that Democrats need to do better with male voters. Okay, first of all, I don't think that's actually completely true. I mean, they do, but the best way to do that is not to nominate a woman as president. That's seriously the way to do it because they did fine with men in 2020 when Biden was top of the ticket. Secondly, they do better with younger voters. Well, latest numbers I've seen of younger voters is that Trump supports cratering among them. Secondly, young people, they don't vote. You don't really, that's not who you're relying on. Third, Maine, oldest state in the country. All right, that's the big issue in Maine. And you want old people, especially old, also suburban women who are the most solid constituency of the Democratic Party outside of black women to vote for Democratic candidates and to vote for Mills. They're more likely to vote for Mills than for Plattner. So I just think I forget where I'm going with this whole argument, but the bottom line is like the idea Democrats need to change everything to 2024 and go with some really odd, unusual direction and nominate like political outsiders misunderstands what had happened in 2024, why they lost, and misunderstands why Democrats are just doesn't understand at all why Democrats have been successful in winning in swing states over the past, 3 or 4 election cycles. Uh, this is what I think people should be afraid of, Democrats, is that they just overlearn the lesson 2024 and make a series of crucial errors that leads them to throw away winnable races in places like Maine or elsewhere.
You said a lot that I want to respond to, like,
Please.
in different directions. I think
You
you're
should
right.
you should have interrupted me. You
Uh,
should have interrupted
I
me.
think you're right about overreading 2024. I mean, I've said this before. First of all, in terms of 2026, 2028, the issue nexus is going to be totally different. I'm reading more and more about AI and job loss and things like that, and that well could be the issue. And no one talked about that even a little bit in 2024.
No.
And the important swing constituencies change from election to election. We've had soccer moms, security moms, young bros, like you name it. There's a different swing constituency in every election. Democrats have always been more pragmatic, at least at the statewide and national level. And Ethan, I agree that Democrats need to be more
Hey, Ethan
populist.
Regalhow. How you doing, buddy?
Um,
That's an old friend of mine. Hey, good to see you.
Democrats need to be more populist. They need to be focused on economics. They need to sound like they care, and they need to be in communities where the less wealthy are organizing and talking to them and showing them that they care. But there's a difference between nominating more populist candidates, nominating a new generation, and I think Michael and I both agree that we need generational change and nominating a fatally flawed candidate. They
Yeah.
asked Susan Collins about the Democratic primary the other day, and she got this big Cheshire cat grin and said, I'm going to leave that to the Democrats. I'm going to stay out of it. It's a
Yeah.
very interesting race.
She wants to run
She's
against Plattner.
salivating to run
Salivating.
against Graham Plattner. Now, what I think actually brings him down is we have not seen good polling. And between now and June, we're going to see plenty of not just primary polling, but general election polling. And if we see Janet Mills running much better against Susan Collins than Graham Plattner, I think enough people are terrified of Donald Trump and want to check his power that they're going to say, I might like this guy more, but I'm going to vote for her. I have, however, and the other thing is, Michael didn't mention this after all this scandal stuff started to break, he hired a new campaign manager. That
Plattner.
person is now his former campaign manager.
Exactly.
Person lasted like a week. That makes you wonder about what is still to come out about Graham Plattner. And man, it's unique. I haven't seen a candidate who legitimately earned commentary about him being both a Nazi and a socialist
Yeah.
before. Usually it's one or the other extreme.
It's very,
This guy, I
very
would say,
impressive.
has rightfully earned both of them. Hi, Baxter, walking behind Michael. But like I think this guy is unproven. The other thing is, like, you get into a primary race, you know what there's going to be eventually. There're going to be debates. This is
Yeah.
a guy who has not proven he can ever handle a political debate.
No, no.
And it could explode him. And I've said this before. I hedge my answers on this area to say that sometimes voters do extremely stupid things. Sometimes the politics, as we've always known them, get upended. Donald Trump did that. The Tea Party in 2010, I mean, nominating Christine O'Donnell was one of the great blunders of all time. And Republicans did that in a bunch of places in 2010 and 2012. So it's not impossible that Plattner wins either the primary and the general election. But I tend to think that when push comes to shove, you're going to start to see the Angus Kings of the world get off the sideline and say, "Look, folks, you're risking this because they're going to have the polling in hand. That's
Right.
going to say that, hey, Janet Mills can beat Susan Collins and Graham Plattner can't." The other thing
But
I have to
I also just think that like those kind of candidates just don't do well in Democratic primaries. They just don't. I mean, we can talk about bad Democratic candidates in places like Wisconsin with Mandela Barnes, but Mandela Barnes basically was lieutenant governor and he raised more money and everyone else dropped out. In Florida, we can say Andrew Gillum was a worse candidate than Gwen Graham, but I mean, that was a close election.
and
I
Tom
mean,
Steyer spent a lot of money to make
yeah,
that
and it
happen.
wasn't obvious that Gillum was going to lose, or that he was a terrible candidate. I mean, I remember a piece at the time thought he was pretty impressive. So I got that one wrong. But I just think that Democrats don't make these kinds of mistakes. Republicans do it over and over again. It's why they lose so many winnable races. But I want to pick up on Ethan's point about the populism. Just one thing that I think is really important to remember is that Kamala Harris ran a very populist campaign, right? She ran on Trump's corruption, on his close ties with billionaires, and I always want to think it's important to point out, in the places where she campaigned the most vigorously, the swing states, she overperformed. She did better there than she did elsewhere in the country. A lot of the drop off in Democratic support was because Democrats just lost support, or Democratic numbers fell in places like New York and California and Illinois, and places where Democrats, as New Jersey, places Democrats were going to win, but where the support just wasn't as strong. But in the swing states, she actually did. I think it was like a 6-point shift or 7-point shift, or 6-point shift in the electorate, and it was like a 2-point shift in swing states or something like that. I forget exactly the numbers, but she overperformed there, and she did it. Pos- Partially, I think. I mean, you could argue that the message kind of had an impact. She ran a very populist campaign, and I think Democrats actually are much more capable of running a populist campaign in 2026 than Republicans are. And I think Janet Mills can run a populist campaign. But here's the thing. Populism is all well and good. The issue in 2026 is not going to be economic populism. It's going to be Donald Trump. And this is what the planning people get wrong, is they think we need to be economically populist. Yeah, okay, fine. That's all well and good. That's a 2028 problem. Your 2026 problem is beating Donald Trump. And right now, and this goes back to what we said at the beginning of the conversation, the biggest driver, the biggest thing happening in American politics today is that Donald Trump is unpopular. Why do you lose in 2018? Not because Democrats ran a populist message, but because they ran against Trump, who was unpopular. And I can't make this point enough. That, look, I go back and look at Janet Mills' video announcing your candidacy. Okay, what do you think of Janet Mills? Look, I'm sure that there was a lot of money spent on focus grouping that video, on polling the messages in that video. And what was the message in that video? It was 100% Susan Collins is too close to Donald Trump and too supportive of Trump. It wasn't about policy issues. It wasn't about populism. It mentioned abortion only in criticizing Collins for voting for Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. The point that actually drove that was opposition to Trump. It's the same thing, by the way, that is driving California, this proposition, which is going to pass easily. What was the message in California? Stick it to Donald Trump. And if Spanberger wins, she's been running against Chitterelli and his ties to Trump. So I just think that
you flip them.
Cheryl, I keep getting confused. Sorry, Mike and Cheryl. I just think, Ethan, I don't even know if I disagree with you, but right now, the populism, Democrats don't need a positive agenda. They need to run against Trump, who is deeply unpopular. That is how they're going to get back into political power. And if they can do, and that is, and they have to find candidates who will not alienate voters who in the middle, who like Democrats who voted for Collins in the past. And that person is Janet Mills. It's not Graham Plattner.
I, Ethan, am very sympathetic to the idea, and I may have to sneeze here again. But it's hard. We don't have commercial breaks for that kind of thing. But
Right.
I am sympathetic to the idea that we need more populist candidates, authentically populist candidates who don't come from wealth, don't come from power circles, aren't totally urbane. But there is a way that you do that. And the way I've mentioned her before, Rebecca Cook is the diner waitress in, I think it's Western Wisconsin. Derek Van Orden is the congressman. And she dramatically overperformed Harris in that district. She's running again, and most people think she's going to beat Van Orden this time. That's how you do it. You run for the House, you work your way up, you prove that you know how to do politics. And it would not shock me at all if Rebecca Cook ends up a senator at some point down the line, or a long-standing fixture in the House. You build that bench at the state office level, at the House level. You don't start at saying, "Hey, we're going to take this completely untested
Absolutely.
commodity," who
100%.
then proves to have lots of baggage that we're going to overlook at the statewide level in the most significant swing
You
state.
don't throw a political nobody into one of the most important Senate elections in all of the country. You just don't do that.
Let me use a sports analogy. You don't call up that kid pitcher to pitch in the World Series unless you're
Will Klein.
really desperate. Right. You don't Will Klein comes in the 15th inning of the game
Mhm.
when you are in trouble. And it worked for the Dodgers. Okay, but the guy who started the game, Tyler Glass, now has a $175 million contract.
For a
Okay,
reason.
that's for a reason. That's what you do in the World Series, as
Absolutely.
opposed to some random doubleheader game in July where you need an extra arm and you want to see what the guy can do. The
Wait,
political equivalent of that July doubleheader game is a place like Texas where you haven't won a statewide race in 2 decades or more, and you can take a chance. You don't do that in Maine. This is the World Series of Senate races.
absolutely. Like I said before, if
And
you want to, yeah, you want to vote for Seth Moulton in Massachusetts, fine. Either way,
yeah,
you Democrats going to win that seat.
and looking down ballot in House races, we have countless House races where you have people who've never been in elected office, who have interesting backgrounds, who could end up being the proven Graham Plattner in 2 years or 4 years. And I think it's great that they're running. I think it's great that we have a younger generation with interesting, diverse experiences trying to get elected. And I don't have a problem even with the like AOCs of the world who are in the House. I just think that the stakes here are too high.
Yeah.
Mills is for all of her flaws, and her flaws basically come down to her birth date, quite frankly. Is still a two-term governor and has a certain floor, and she's not somebody who's lost her last election. You know, the governors who tend to be bad candidates tend to be people who've lost their last elections or haven't been in office in 10 years. Um, and I'd also be remiss if I didn't point out the moral thing here. We have always been the party that had a certain level of values.
Oh man,
And
thank you for bringing this up.
Graham Plattner, the people twisting themselves into pretzels, and I'm looking at you, Pod Save America guys. And look,
Oh my
you're a lot
God,
more successful than
100%.
I am. You've made a lot of money. You've built a big podcast. I wish I had built that empire that they have built. But those guys, and then some of these people on the left who are contorting themselves into pretzels to say, "Oh, we've got to still be for Graham Plattner, Martin Heinrich, and Bernie Sanders, and a couple of these other folks
Chris
in
Murphy.
Chris
Chris
Murphy."
Murphy.
From Connecticut who are just like all of a sudden none of our values matter. And absolutely know that if Graham Plattner was a Republican, they'd
They
be
would
telling you that
be
he's a racist,
pillorying
anti-Semite,
him.
misogynistic, and they'd be pillaring every other Republican who
The
didn't
fucking
condemn
guy
him.
has a Nazi goddamn
Act
tattoo.
insignia on
Like,
his
I don't
chest.
give a and don't give me this bullshit. You didn't know what it was. Like, that's actually says even worse about you that you got a fucking tattoo. You didn't even know what the hell the insignia meant. But whatever the case is, we would never be this empathetic with a
No.
Republican who did this.
And
Not in a million years would Chris Murphy be that empathetic.
don't you dare malign our veterans and say this is all about PTSD and people coming back, because scores of veterans came back without Nazi tattoos,
Thank
no
you.
matter how many issues they had. Do we stand for something as a party or do we not? Is every attack that we've ever leveled against Donald Trump hypocritical and fake, or is it real? For me, it was real. And I'm not willing, whether it's Zoran or it's Graham Plattner, to stand for misogyny, anti Semitism, or racism. Now, look, there is a line here where that kind of worrying about that stuff does verge into cancel culture,
Yes.
where somebody listened to one off color joke or told an off color joke, or a comedian is trying to be funny, or you start going after average Joes and their employment. There are lines that we've crossed that I think the left has crossed in the last decade that have been unhelpful and that have been wrong. Okay. But this is not that. This is a Nazi tattoo and guy going on Reddit saying racist things, complaining that black people don't tip, which is at most a stereotype. He said some misogynistic things. He sort of blamed women for sexual assault,
Yes.
victim shaming, like
Look,
really terrible
can I just
stuff.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but I wanted to add one point. Look, I think Democrats need to expand the tent a little bit, and they need to
Yeah,
consider candidates who take positions that maybe like Dan Osborne, who's running
yeah,
who's running for Senate as independent in Nebraska. A lot of Democrats basically backed him. I mean, he was much tougher on immigration issues than a lot of other Democrats have been, and I think you give that guy a pass because he's running in a place like Nebraska where you have to take that position. You don't have to find a candidate who basically has used, and I'm going to use the word, a derogatory term begins with an R about people who are mentally disabled. You don't need to pick somebody who has a Nazi tattoo. You don't need to pick somebody who is asked, why don't black people tip? You don't need to take somebody who's played down sexual assault. You can find a candidate there who is just as good as Graham Plattner, in fact, governor, actually, who hasn't said these things and who's actually a better candidate to win the election. The thing that I think your point is so spot on. And but look, you can surrender some of your values. You can surrender on some policy issues, but there has to be a limit, and and it has to make political sense
I,
to do that.
I'll give you a great example. If Mary Patola declares tomorrow for Senate in Alaska, she can court the NRA all she wants. She can stand up there with an AR-15, and I will donate money to her, even though I believe in more gun control. If there is a viable pro-life candidate in a red state, I will donate to that person, even though I think they are dead wrong on abortion.
Actually,
Okay.
I might draw the line there myself personally. But go ahead.
I, it depends on the place. If we're talking about we could flip the Louisiana Senate race, I'd give to John Bell Edwards if he was running. I'm a pragmatist, and I sort of go back to the old kind of idea of like, is this guy better than the alternative in an election? If they are going to vote with me 50% of the time, Joe Manchin drove me nuts. Okay, I would have voted for Joe Manchin in a heartbeat because he is way better than Jim Justice. His Jim Justice has not voted against the Republicans at all. Joe
Right.
Manchin did. Okay, and again, I am even willing to countenance. You told an off-color joke. You said something in college 20 years ago. Yeah, I'm willing to let bygones be bygones. I'm willing to say that, yeah, comedians say off-color things, and so do average Joes. I'm willing to countenance some things where I think, yeah, that was wrong, but I am not willing to countenance an absolute parade of offensive things, derogatory things, bigoted things for a candidate where there's absolutely no there's no need to
To nominate him.
do this. There's
Yeah.
absolutely no need to nominate him.
Like,
And look,
to your point, but just to your point, like Manchin, if your choice between Manchin and Justice, like Democrats should pick Manchin, even with all of his flaws. That is not the choice in Maine. Not
no,
between Plattner and Collins, between Plattner and Mills. By the way, it's a better candidate.
right.
It's an insane position to take. And again, I go back to what I said earlier. It's a complete overread of what happened in 2024 to believe that. Like I saw this. Who wrote it? Was it Heinrich or somebody said that we need to do better among male voters, young men, or working class voters. And I think it
And
was Jake Auchenluss, that is the guy in Massachusetts, who basically said, "I'm all for appealing to male voters, but can we find a guy that doesn't have a friggin' Nazi tattoo?" Yeah,
I
that's a
mean,
good point,
it
actually.
is so offensive and patronizing to young men to say, well, if we don't take the guy with the Nazi tattoo, we're gonna scare them into silence. Look, I teach college students, okay? Um, I have had students say to me privately, look, I don't know what I can say anymore. I don't weigh in more in class because I don't know where the lines are before I start getting judged socially. I think there are issues there in terms of young men being frustrated and confused about what they can say, what they can't say. They are attracted to voices who are willing to push boundaries. They are attracted to candidates who are willing to say, "Hey, let's let anything go, more speech." But
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that they are not offended by Nazi tattoos. That doesn't mean that they have no core moral values. That doesn't mean that they're okay with victim shaming on sexual assault or blatant racism. And again, if you are saying this, if you are making this case against or in favor of Graham Plattner, then you have lost all moral authority to ever critique Donald Trump on any of these things. Doesn't matter.
That's good. That goes too far. That goes too
No,
far.
no, but Michael, you can't worry about Donald Trump being a misogynist if you're not worried about Graham
But
Plattner
it's a
being
question
a
of degree,
misogynist.
isn't it? Isn't it a question of degree?
Yeah, but you're and again, I'm not saying you've lost all moral authority to critique Donald Trump on everything. What I'm saying is
Sure.
on these issues, I don't want to hear about, well, Donald Trump is okay courting the far right extremists, Nazi types. I don't want to hear from those people, the pod save guys. Well, Donald Trump said this misogynistic thing today, or God, these are the people who lost their minds when he said shithole countries, or when he derided Baltimore. in a racist way, and rightfully so. But you lose moral authority to comment on his racism if you're not worried about Democrats who happen to be racist. And in fact, you endorse them and shame those of us who are bothered by that. I don't know. I'm just old fashioned. I'm a pragmatist, but I have principles and moral lines that you just cannot cross.
I look, I think it's a fair point. Look, I'm a pragmatist too. I think people draw the line in different places. But I think I go back to what you said a few minutes ago. You know, you and I can disagree about where that line can be drawn. But where I think we do agree is that you don't draw the line for a candidate who isn't even a good candidate,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I will draw the line in friggin' Mississippi or John Bell Edwards in Louisiana because the only hope of winning a governor's race in Louisiana is to nominate somebody who's more conservative. And frankly, look, I really bothered by John Bell Edwards' positions on abortion. But you
Yeah.
know, Medicaid expansion happened in Louisiana, which saved lots of lives because the Democrat in the governor's mansion. So you know, you sort of make those pragmatic choices in politics. Look, I didn't agree with Barack Obama when he opposed same-sex marriage when he ran for president in 2008, and I thought that he was lying, and he totally was.
Was.
But I also understood that like he's making a pragmatic. I didn't like it, and I think I criticized him for it. But I get that you're making a pragmatic political decision. I understand that. But this is we're talking about something very very different in Maine because those are choices that do not have to be made. And do not ask me. I think you're exactly right about this. Do not ask me to surrender my values and what I believe for a candidate who isn't even a viable candidate. If you're going to ask me to do that, that's a tough thing to do, but there has to be a rationale for it.
And let me give you another dynamic to this, which is you're not running against Rick Scott, or I'm trying to pick my least favorite Republicans in the Senate who are just absolutely terrible.
Marsha Blackburn,
Marsha Blackburn, Tom Cotton, people like that. By the way, if you're mad that we're flipping the clocks back and it's be dark before 5 o'clock,
it's
Tom
Tom Cotton's
Cotton
fault.
blocked that bill
Piece of shit.
yesterday.
Yeah.
But anyway, like Susan Collins is not that. There are a lot of people who voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris who voted for Susan Collins at least once, maybe many times over the years. If you ended up with Graham Plattner and Susan Collins, they can easily talk themselves into saying, you know what? Susan Collins is not so bad. And I'm willing to vote for her again, even though she's going to vote for the wrong guy for leader in the Senate.
Oh no, I disagree. Oh, I disagree with that. Susan
I'm
Collins
not saying
she's part of the problem.
look. I'm not saying I would say that. I would vote for Graham Plattner in a general election over Susan Collins because he would vote for whoever the Democratic leader is, not
Yeah,
John
exactly.
Thune, and that would give us a check on Donald Trump. However, what I'm saying is, for example, I had a graduate school friend who's from Maine who came from a Republican family, who was slightly left of center, and who at least one of her parents was not a Trump fan. At the last time I talked to her, it was years ago. Okay, I'm thinking about people like that. People who live in like Cape Elizabeth in the suburbs of Portland who came out of the moderate Republican tradition in Maine.
Yeah, yeah,
People who
sure.
voted for Olympia Snow, who voted for Susan Collins, who were perfectly comfortable voting for moderate Republicans pre-Trump, and who have probably soured on Trump. And just as the white blue collar guys in northern Maine have kind of turned on the Democrats, Democrats have maintained their margin because they pulled in these suburban voters around Portland.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. What I'm saying is people with that heritage are not necessarily going to look at this race and say, well, I got to vote for Graham Plattner. I have no choice. These are people who, over the course of the last 30 years, have voted for Susan Collins. And I would not rule out them voting for her again. This is not a situation in which it's a no brainer that if Graham Plattner's the nominee, people will hold their nose and vote for him. And,
I
and
agree.
so,
Uh,
and so it really is just politically, it's as stupid as trying to run a play up a touchdown when the other team is out of timeouts and there's 45 seconds left. Like there's a reason the miracle. You look up Google Miracle at the Meadowlands. There's a reason
I
teams
watched
just
that
take a
live. I
knee.
watched that live, by the way. I watched that live.
Did you? Let's
I
see.
did.
I
Yeah.
mean, but like, there's a reason people take a knee now and don't take the risk. You do not need to nominate Graham Plattner.
Look, I'll just
Um,
say. I'll just say last but point. Your point is exactly correct. And just you know, the reason why Susan Collins has won a seat that she shouldn't hold. I mean, it's a blue state, is because she's convinced enough Democrats to switch sides and vote for her. I mean, in 2020, she won. Biden won by like what 8 or 9 points, and she won with like a 15-point gap between her and Biden. She convinced enough
Yeah.
Democrats that she was a better choice. Now, that's a harder, I think argument to make in a midterm election. It's going to be harder for
I think
Collins
it's
to make that
harder
case.
in 2025 than it was in 2020.
Uh,
Trump
yeah, probably,
Trump
probably,
has gotten
but
even worse.
it's gotten worse. But he was pretty bad in 2022. But yeah, it's a fair point. But I think the point is that you want to make it as easy as you possibly can for people who have switched party, have gone across the aisle and have voted for Susan Collins, who are Democrats, to come back to the Democratic Party. You want to make it as easy. And this is, by the way, again, I'll make the last point. We really got to finish it up. I think this point is it's getting late. But last point I'll make about this is that you know this is why overinterpreting 2024 is such a mistake. Every state is different. And, in Maine, what you're trying to do ultimately to win there is you need to win over those sort of middle of the road Democrats who switch sides for Collins and convince them to come back to the Democratic Party. And you have to think about who is the candidate who is best able to do that. And I know it's asking in a primary, you're asking voters to say, don't think about which candidate you prefer. Think about who's most likely to win. But those are pragmatic choices Democrats have made historically. They made it in 2020 when they elected elected Joe Biden as the Democratic nominee. They paid the pragmatic choice to pick the guy who was most likely to beat Trump, and there was a correct calculation on their part. And that's the calculation that has to happen now. I'll just say the last thing I'll say is like at the end of the day, whatever Mills or Plattner's position on the issues are, it doesn't really matter because we live in a polarized environment in which all that matters is that Democrats have more D's than R's in the Senate. And if getting more D's means voting for Mills, you vote for Mills because you know what? From a policy standpoint, neither one of them are going to be effective at getting their agendas pushed through, particularly if Republicans are the ones who control the Senate.
I I, I agree with that. I would just add one more thing as we finish because it brings us back to where we started. We just got a new Wisconsin Marquette poll in the last hour tracking poll. President Trump approval rating in Wisconsin: disapprove 53%, approve 46%. That's the shift of it was 52 to 47 last month in terms of or disapprove. And so he's shrinking there, whereas Tony Evers, the Democrat governor, is at 50% approval and a 45% disapproval. So it shows Wisconsin the closest to the swing states in 2024. It shows he's underwater there. And that is, for all we talk about all these other things, that is the most important factor in our politics right now in terms of if you want to know how elections are going to go next week, next year, next month, that is what matters. And so keep your eyes on that because it really is the main kind of feature.
I 100% agree with you. 100% agree with you. So we just missed 200. We got 196, which is nice. We got to get over 200 next time. We got to get 300 next time. We got.
Yeah.
So tell your friends,
And
tell
we
your
will
loved
we'll
ones.
wrap we're going to wrap up the election for you. We're
That's
going to
right.
have been able to sleep on the results and come back and give you a measured take on what did these results mean, if anything.
Absolutely.
And we will have an indication by the time we're with you next Wednesday of whether it's changed anything with regard to the shutdown.
Yes.
And we'll see what gyrations Trump gets into on Truth Social to explain away a loss on the elections. He will probably focus on Zoran, is my
I'm guessing
guess.
he will focus on my dog. My dog is basically making clear that he wants this conversation to end. We're gonna have to
See,
finish this
this is
up.
why I
This
do it on Wednesday. The dog's not here on Wednesday.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Yeah, no, I have the dog. Yeah.
yeah,
Baxter's always here.
yeah,
Uh
because she Tuesday or Thursday she'd be looking at me being like, "Let's go sit outside. Why are
I
you on
I
this
took I
thing?"
took him to the dog run today. I think that would get him. That would be enough. But apparently,
No,
well,
no,
someone
no.
was outside. He has to protect the
Demanding. You
domicile.
look, you're his manservant, and
It's true.
he is
I
not
know.
being served well.
It's true. It is true. It is true. All right. Listen. Thank you, everyone who joined us. If you haven't subscribed to Brian's Substack, The World According to Brian. Please subscribe. It is fantastic. If you haven't subscribed to Truth and Consequences, please subscribe to that. We will see you next week with our postmortems on the New Jersey, Virginia governor's races, the New York mayoral race. And Brian, have a great week. We'll
Thank you.
see
You too.
you. I'll see you a week
And,
from today.
maybe we'll talk at 3 a.m. during the baseball game
Oh my
before the week's
God.
over.
Let's hope there's no more 18 games because that almost ruined my week. As I said on Twitter, Monday night 17 inning World Series game is my least favorite Sartre play. So I don't want to repeat that. I'd prefer not to. All right.
All
Thanks,
right.
everybody.
Take care, everybody.
We'll see ya. Have a good one. Bye bye.
Bye.